Hi guys, this is Allison from Allykatkreations. How are you? I had to take a break from my other videos. I did two. They were very long. Gonna finish this off, I hope, today. It's not that long. Before I do, please like, share, subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. If my work and anything that I do resonates with you and you're getting something out of it, if you have it within you to give me a love donation or to support my work, it is very appreciated. Up Queenie is coming, or co-host number 1. Here she comes. Had to make room for my little princess. So I hope everybody's having a really good day. I was really super excited to read The Key of Destiny. Amazing. And then I have another book, The Mastery of Destiny, written by somebody else. I might start that as well. I want to, again, pack in enough books where I can. Obviously, I don't have enough behind me. I read a lot of different books. So I'll read a few chapters in one, and then I'll focus what I want to put on for you guys. And then because they had to revamp a bunch, I have to go back and like take notes. So I have a whole bunch of scatteredness everywhere. It's chaos, but it's good. It's good chaos. So, Kant, whatever you want to call him. Fundamental principles of the Metaphysic of Morals. This is a third section, transition from the Metaphysic of Morals to critique of pure practical reason. Morgan likes to eat my mechanical pencils. Like she chews them. I don't know why, if she's just anxious. I don't know. It's my kid in fur form. The concept of freedom is the key that explains the autonomy of the will. The will is a kind of causality belonging to living beings insofar as they are rational. And freedom will be this property of such causality that it can be efficient independently on foreign causes, determining it just as physical necessity is property, that the causality of all irrational beings has of being determined to activity by the influence of foreign causes. The preceding definition of freedom is negative and therefore unfruitful for the discovery of its essence, but it leads to a positive conception, which is so much the more full and fruitful, since the conception of causality involves that of laws, according to which, by something that we call cause, something else, namely the effect, must be produced, laid down. Hence, although freedom is not a property of the will, depending on physical laws, yet it is not for that reason lawless. On the contrary, it must be a causality acting according to the immutable laws, but of a particular kind. Otherwise, a free will would be an absurdity. Physical necessity is a hieronymy of the efficient causes, for every effect is possible only according to this law, that something else determines the efficient cause to exert its causality. What else, then, can freedom of the will be but autonomy? That is the property of the will to be a law to itself. But the proposition, the will is in every action a law to itself, only expresses the principle to act on no other maxim than that which can also have as an object itself as universal law. Now this is precisely the formula of the categorical imperative and is the principle of morality, so that a free will and a free will subject to moral laws are one and the same. On this hypothesis, then, of freedom of the will, morality together with its principle follows from it by mere analysis of the conception. However, the latter is still a synthetic proposition. An absolutely good will is that whose maxim can always include itself regarded as a universal law. For this property of its maxim can never be discovered by analyzing the conception of an absolutely good will. Now, such a synthetic proposition are only possible in this way, that the two cognitions are connected together by their union with a third in which they are both to be found. The positive conception of freedom furnishes this third cognition, which cannot, as the physical causes, be the nature of the sensible world, in the concept of which we find conjoined the concept of something in relation as cause to something else as effect. We cannot now at once show what this third is to which freedom points us, and of which we have an idea a priori, nor can we make intelligible how the concept of freedom is shown to be legitimate from principles of pure practical reason, and with it the possibility of categorical imperative, but some further preparation is required. Freedom must be presupposed as a property of the will of all rational beings. It is not enough to predict freedom of our own will from whatever reason, if we have not sufficient grounds for predicting the same of all rational beings. For as morality serves as a law for us only because we are rational beings, it must also hold for all rational beings, and as it must be deduced simply from the property of freedom, it must be shown that freedom also is a property of all rational beings. It is not enough then to prove it from certain supposed experiences of human nature, which indeed is quite impossible, and it can only be shown a priori. But we must show that it belongs to the activity of all rational beings endowed with a will. Now I say every being that cannot act except under the idea of freedom is just for that reason, in a practical point of view, really free. That is to say, all laws which are inseparably connected with freedom have the same force for him as if his will had been shown to be free in itself by a proof theoretically conclusive. Now I affirm that we must attribute to every rational being which has a will that it has also the idea of freedom and acts entirely under this idea. For in such a being, we conceive a reason that is practical, that is, has causality in reference to its objects. Now we cannot possibly conceive a reason consciously receiving a bias from any other quarter with respect to its judgments, for then the subject would ascribe the determination of its judgment not to its own reason, but to an impulse. It must regard itself as the author of its principles, independent on foreign influences. Consequently, as practical reason or as the will of a rational being, it must regard itself as free. That is to say, the will of such a being cannot be a will of its own except under the idea of freedom. This idea must therefore, in a practical point of view, be ascribed to every rational being. But are we really free? Of the interest attaching to the ideas of morality. We have finally reduced the definite conception of morality to the idea of freedom. This later, however, we could not prove to be actually a property of ourselves or of a human nature. Only we saw that it must be presupposed if we would conceive a being as a rational and conscious of its causality in respect of its actions, as endowed with a will. And so we find that on just the same grounds, we must ascribe to every being endowed with reason and will this attribute of determining itself to action under the idea of its freedom. Now, it resulted also from the presupposition of the idea that we became aware of a law that the subjective principles of action, maxims, must always be so assumed that they can also hold an objective, that is, universal principles, and so serve as universal laws of our own dictation. But why then should I subject myself to this principle, and that simply as a rational being, thus also subjecting to it all other beings endowed with reason? I will allow that no interest urges me to this, for that would not give a categorical imperative, but I must take an interest in it and discern how this comes to pass. For this I ought is properly and I would valid for every rational being, provided only that reason determined his actions without any hindrance. But for beings that are in addition affected as we are by springs of a different kind, namely sensibility, in whose case that is not only done with reason alone would do for these, that necessity is expressed only as an ought, and the subjective necessity is different from the objective. It seems then as if the moral law, that is the principle of autonomy of the will, were properly speaking only presupposed in the idea of freedom. And if we could not prove its reality in objective necessity independently, in that case, we should still have gained something considerable by at least determining the true principle more exactly than had previously had done. But as regards to its validity and the practical necessity of subjecting oneself to it, we should not have advanced a step. For if we were asked why the universal validity of our maxim as a law must be condition restricting our actions, and on what ground the worth which we assign to this matter of acting a worth so great that there cannot be any higher interest, and if we were asked further how it happens that it is by this alone a man believes he feels his own personal worth, in comparison with which that of an agreeable or disagreeable condition is to be regarded as nothing. To these questions, we could give no satisfactory answer. We find indeed sometimes that we can take an interest in a personal quality which does not involve any interest of external condition, provided this quality makes us capable of participating in the condition in case reason were to affect the allotment. That is to say, the mere being worthy of happiness can interest of itself, even without the motive of participating in this happiness. This judgment, however, is in fact only the effect of the importance of the moral law, which we before presupposed when, by the idea of freedom, we detach ourselves from every empirical interest, but that we ought to detach ourselves from these interests, to consider ourselves as free in action and yet as subject to certain laws, so as to find a worth simply in our own person, which can compensate for us the loss of everything that gives worth to our condition. This we are not yet able to discern in this way, nor do we see how it is possible so to act. In other words, whence the moral law derives its obligation. It must be freely admitted that there is a sort of circle here from which it seems impossible to escape. In the order of efficient cause, we assume ourselves free, in order that in the order of ends, we may conceive ourselves as subject to moral laws. And we afterwards conceive ourselves as subject to these laws, because we have attributed to ourselves freedom of will. For freedom and self-legislation of will are both autonomy, and therefore are reciprocal conceptions. And for this very reason, one must not be used to explain the other or give the reason of it, but at most only for logical purposes to reduce apparently different notions of the same object to one single concept, as we reduce different fractions of the same value to the lowest terms. One resource remains to us, namely to inquire whether we do not occupy different points of view when by means of freedom we think ourselves as cause efficient a priori, and when we form our conception of ourselves, form our actions as effects which we see before our eyes. It is a remark which needs no subtle reflection to make, but which we may assume that even the commonest understanding can make, although it be after its fashion by the obscure discernment of judgment it calls feeling, that all the ideas that come to us involuntarily, also those of senses, do not enable us to know objects otherwise than as they affect us, so that what they may be themselves remains unknown to us. And consequently, that as regards ideas of this kind, even with the closest attention and clearness that the understanding can apply to them, we can by them only obtain to the knowledge of appearances, never to that of things in themselves. As soon as this distinction has once been made, perhaps merely in consequence of the difference observed between the ideas given us from without and in which we are passive, and those that we produce simply from ourselves, and in which we show our own activity, then it follows of itself that we must admit and assume behind the appearance something else that is not an appearance, namely the things in themselves, although we must admit that as they can never be known to us except as they affect us, we can come no nearer to them, nor can we ever know what they are in themselves. This must furnish a distinction, however crude, between a world of sense and a world of understanding, of which the former may be different according to the difference of the sensuous impressions in various observers, while the second, which its basis always remains the same. Even as to himself, a man cannot pretend to know what he is in himself from the knowledge he has by internal sensation, whereas he does not, as it were, create himself and does not come by the conception of himself a priori, but empirically, it naturally follows that he can obtain his knowledge even of himself only by the inner sense, and consequently only through the appearances of his nature and the way in which his consciousness is affected. At the same time, beyond these characteristics of his own subject, made up of mere appearances, he must necessarily suppose something else as their basis, namely his ego, whatever its characteristic in itself may be. Thus, in respect to mere perception and receptivity of sensation, he must reckon himself as belonging to the world of sense. But in respect of whatever there may be of pure activity in him, that which reaches consciousness immediately and not through affecting the senses, he must reckon himself as belonging to the intellectual world, of which, however, he has no further knowledge. To such a conclusion, the reflecting man must come with respect to all things which can be presented to him. It is probably to be met with even in persons of the commonest understanding, who, as it well known, are very much inclined to suppose behind the objects of the senses something else invisible and acting of itself. They spoil it, however, by sensualizing this invisible again, that is to say, wanting to make it an object of intuition, so they do not become a whit the wiser. Now man really finds in himself a faculty by which he distinguishes himself from everything else, even from himself as affected by objects, and that is reason. This being pure spontaneity is even elevated above the understanding, for although the latter is a spontaneity and does not, like sense, merely contain intuitions that arise when we are affected by things and are therefore passive, yet it can not produce from its activity any other conceptions than those which merely serve to bring the intuitions of sense under rules, and thereby to unite them in one consciousness. And without this use of the sensibility, it could not think at all. Whereas, on the contrary, reason shows so pure a spontaneity in the case of what I call ideas, ideal conceptions, that is thereby far transcends everything that the sensibility can give it, and exhibits its most important function in distinguishing the world of sense from that of understanding, and thereby prescribing the limits of the understanding itself. For this reason, a rational being must regard himself quo intelligence, not from the side of his lower faculties, as belonging not to the world of sense, but to that of understanding. Hence, he has 2 points of view from which he can regard himself, and recognize laws of the exercise of his faculties, and consequently of all his actions. First, so far as he belongs to the world of sense, he finds himself subject to laws of nature, hieronymy. Secondly, as belonging to the intelligible world, under laws, which being independent on nature have their foundation not in experience but in reason alone. As a rational being, and consequently belonging to the intelligible world, man can never conceive the causality of his own will otherwise than on condition of the idea of freedom for independence, on the determining causes of the sensible world, an independence which reason must always ascribe to itself is freedom. Now the idea of freedom is inseparably connected with the conception of autonomy, and this again with the universal principle of morality, which is ideally the foundation of all actions of rational beings, just as the law of nature is of all phenomena. Now the suspicion is removed when, which we raise above, there was a latent circle involved in our reasoning from freedom to autonomy, and from this is the moral law, that that we lay down the idea of freedom because of the moral law, only that we might afterwards in turn infer the later from freedom, and that consequently we could assign no reason at all for this law, but could only present it as a partito principali, which well disposed minds would gladly concede to us, but which we could never put forward as a probable proposition. For now we see that when we conceive ourselves as free, we transfer ourselves into the world of understanding as members of it, and recognize the autonomy of the will with its consequence, morality. Whereas if we conceive ourselves as under obligation, we consider ourselves as belonging to the world of sense, and at the same time to the world of understanding. There goes my lazy eye again. Sorry, guys. I know it's weird. I'm trying to fix that. How is a categorical imperative possible? Every rational being reckons himself qua intelligence as to, I hate when that happens, belonging to the world of understanding, and it is simply as an efficient cause belonging to that world that he calls his causality a will. On the other side, he is also conscious of himself as a part of the world of sense, in which his actions, which are mere appearances, phenomena of that causality, are displayed. We cannot, however, discern how they are possible from this causality, which we do not know, but instead of that, these actions as belonging to the sensible world must be viewed as determined by other phenomena, namely desires and inclinations. If therefore I were only a member of the world of understanding, then all my actions would perfectly conform to the principle of autonomy of the pure will. If I were only a part of the world of sense, they would necessarily be assumed to conform wholly to the natural law of desires and inclinations. In other words, to the hierarchy of nature. The former would rest on morality as the supreme principle, the later on happiness. Since, however, the world of understanding contains the foundation of the world of sense and consequently of its laws, also and accordingly gives the law to my will, which belongs wholly to the world of understanding, directly, and must be conceived as doing so. It follows that although on the one side I must regard myself as a being belonging to the world of sense, yet on the other side, I must recognize myself as a subject, as an intelligence to the law of the world of understanding. To reason, which contains this law in the idea of freedom, and therefore as subject to the autonomy of the will. Consequently, I must regard the laws of the world of understanding as imperatives for me, and the actions which conform to them as duties. And thus, what makes categorical imperatives possible is this, that the idea of freedom makes me a member of an intelligible world, in consequence of which I were nothing else, all my actions would always conform to the autonomy of the will. But as I, at the same time, intuit myself as a member of the world of sense, they ought so to conform, and this categorical ought implies a synthetic a priori proposition, inasmuch as besides my will, as affected by sensible desires, there is added further the idea of the same will, but as belonging to the world of understanding, pure and practical of itself, which contains the supreme condition according to reason of the form of will. Precisely as to the intuitions of sense, there are added concepts of the understanding, which of themselves signify nothing but regular form in general. And in this way, synthetic a priori propositions become possible on which all knowledge of this physical nature rests. The practical use of common human reason confirms this reasoning. There is no one not even the most consummate villain, provided only that he is otherwise accustomed to the use of reason, who, when he set before him examples of honesty of purpose, of steadfastness in following good maxims, of sympathy and general benevolence, even combined with great sacrifices of advantage and comfort, does not wish that he might also possess these qualities. Only on account of his inclinations and impulses, he cannot obtain this in himself, but at the same time, he wishes to be free from such inclinations which are burdensome to himself. He proves by this that he transfers himself in thought with a will free from the impulses of the sensibility into an order of things wholly different from that of his desires in the field of the sensibility, since he cannot expect to obtain by that wish any gratification of his desires, nor any position which would satisfy any of his actual or supposable inclinations, for this would destroy the preeminence of the very idea which wrests that wish from him. He can only expect a greater intrinsic worth of his own person. This better person, however, he imagines himself to be when he transfers himself to the point of view of a member of the world of the understanding, to which he is involuntarily forced by the idea of freedom, of independence, undetermining cause of the world of sense. And from the point of view, he is conscious of a good will, which by his own confession constitutes a law for the bad will that he possesses as a member of the world of the sense, a law whose authority he recognizes while transgressing it. What he morally ought is then what he necessarily would as a member of the world of the understanding, and is conceived by him as an ought, only inasmuch as he likewise considers himself as a member of the world of sense. In extreme limits of all practical philosophy, all men attribute to themselves freedom of will. Hence come all judgments upon actions as being such an ought to have been done, although they have not been done. However, this freedom is not a conception of experience, nor can it be so, since it still remains, even though experience shows the contrary of what on supposition of freedom are conceived as it is necessary consequences. On the other side, it is equally necessary that everything that takes place should be fixedly determined according to the laws of nature. This necessity of nature is likewise not an empirical conception, just for the reason that it involves the motion of necessity and consequently of a priori cognition. But this conception of a system of nature is confirmed by the experience, and it must even be inevitably presupposed if experience itself is to be possible. That is, a connected knowledge of the objects of sense resting on general laws. Therefore, freedom is only an idea of conception, of reason, and its objective reality in itself is doubtful, while nature is a concept of the understanding which proves and must necessarily prove its reality in examples of experience. There arises from this a dialectic of reason, since the freedom attributed to the will appears to contradict the necessity of nature, and placed between these two ways, reason for speculative purposes finds the road of physical necessity much more beaten and more appropriate than that of freedom. Yet for practical purposes, the narrow footpath of freedom is the only one on which it is possible to make use of reason in our conduct. Hence, it is just as impossible for the subtlest philosophy as the commonest reason of men to argue away freedom. Philosophy must then assume that no real contradiction will be found between the freedom and physical necessity of the same human actions, for it cannot give up the conception of nature any more than that of freedom. Nevertheless, even though we should never be able to comprehend how freedom is possible, we must at least remove this apparent contradiction in a receiving manner. For if the thought of freedom contradicts either itself or nature, which is equally necessary, it must, in competition with physical necessity, be entirely given up. It would, however, be impossible to escape this contradiction if the thinking subject, which seems to itself free, conceive itself in the same sense or in the very same relation when it calls itself free, as when it, in respect of the same action, it assumes itself to be subject to the law of nature. Hence, it is an indispensable problem of speculative philosophy to show that it is an illusion respecting the contradiction rests on this, that we think of man in a different sense and relation when we call him free. And when we regard him as a subject to the laws of nature as being part of the parcel of nature, it must therefore show that not only can both these very well coexist, but that both must be thought as necessarily united in the same subject, since otherwise no reason could be given why we should burden reason with an idea which, though it may possibly without contradiction be reconciled with another, it is sufficiently established, yet entangles us in a perplexity which sorely embarrasses reason in its theoretical employment. This duty, however, belongs only to the speculative philosophy, in order that it may clear the way for practical philosophy. The philosopher then has no option whether he will remove the apparent contradiction or leave it untouched, for in the latter case, the theory respecting this would be bonum vacans, into the possession of which the fatalist would have a right to enter and chase all morality out of its supposed domain as occupying it without title. We cannot, however, as yet say that we are touching the bonds of practical philosophy, for the settlement of that controversy does not belong to it. It only demands from speculative reason that it should put an end to the discord in which it entangles itself in theoretical questions, so that the practical reason may have rest and security from external attacks, which might make the ground debatable on which it desires to build. The claims to freedom of will, made even by common reason, are founded on the consciousness and the admitted supposition that reason is independent on merely subjectively determined causes, which together constitute what belongs to sensation only, and which consequently come under the general designation of sensibility. Man, considering himself in this way as an intelligence, places himself thereby in a different order of things, and in relation to determining grounds of a wholly different kind, when on the one hand he thinks of himself as an intelligence endowed with a will, and consequently with causality, and when on the other he perceives himself as a phenomenon in the world of sense, as he really is also, and affirms that his causality is subject to external determination according to the laws of nature. Now he soon becomes aware that both can hold good, nay, must hold good at the same time, for there is not the smallest contradiction in saying that a thing in appearance belonging to the world of sense is subject to a certain laws, on which the very same as a thing or a being in itself is independent, and that he must conceive and think of himself in this twofold way: rest as to the first on the consciousness of himself as an object affected through the senses, and as the second on the consciousness of himself as an intelligence, as an independent on sensible impressions, on the employment of his reason, in other words, as belonging to the world of understanding. Hence it comes to pass that man claims the possession of a will, which takes no account of anything that comes under the head of desires and inclinations, and on the contrary conceives actions as possible to him. nay, even as necessary, which can only be done by discharging all desires and sensible inclinations. The causality of such actions lies in him as intelligence and in the laws of effects and actions, which depends on the principles of an intelligent world, of which indeed he knows nothing more than that in a pure reason alone, independent on sensibility, gives a law. Moreover, since it is only in the world as an intelligence that he is proper self, being as a man only the appearance of himself, those laws apply to him directly and categorically, so that the incitements of inclinations and appetites, in other words, the whole nature of the world of its sense, cannot impair the laws of his volition as an intelligence. Nay, he does not even hold himself responsible for the former or ascribe them to the proper self, his will. He only ascribes to his will any indulgence which he might yield them if allowed them to influence his maxims to the prejudice of the rational laws of will. When practical reason thinks itself into a world of understanding, it does not thereby transcend its own limits, as it would if he tried to enter it by intuition or sensation. The former is only a negative thought in respect of the world of sense, which does not give any laws to reason in determining the will, and it's positive only in the single point that this freedom as a negative characteristic is at the same time conjoined with a positive faculty, and even with the causality of reason, which he designated a will, namely a faculty of so acting that the principle of the action shall conform to the essential character of a rational motive, the condition that the maxim have universal validity as law. But were it to borrow an object of will, that is a motive from the world of understanding, then it would overstep its bounds and pretend to be acquainted with something of which it knows nothing. The conception of a world of the understanding is then only a point of view, which reason finds itself compelled to take outside the appearances in order to conceive itself as practical, which would not be possible if the influences of the sensibility had a determining power on man, but which is necessary unless he is to be denied the consciousness of himself as intelligence and consequently as a rational cause, energizing by reason, that is, operating freely. This thought certainly involves the idea of an order and a system of laws different from that of the mechanism of nature, which belongs to the sensible world. And it makes a conception of an intelligible world necessary, that is to say, the whole system of rational beings as things in themselves. But it does not in the least authorize us to think it further than as to its formal condition, only that it is the universality of the maxims of the will as laws, and consequently the autonomy of the latter, which alone is consistent with its freedom. Whereas, on the contrary, all laws that refer to a definite object give heredity, which only belongs to the laws of nature and can only apply to the sensible world. But reason would overstep all its bounds if it undertook to explain how pure reason can be practical, which would be exactly the same problem as to explain how freedom is possible. For we can explain nothing but that which we can reduce to laws, the object of which can be given in some possible experience. But freedom is a mere ideal conception, the objective reality of which can in no wise be shown according to the laws of nature and consequently not in any possible experience. And for this reason, it can never be comprehended or understood, because we cannot support it by any sort of example or analogy. It holds good only as a necessary hypothesis of reason in a being that believes itself conscious of a will, that is, of a faculty distinct from mere desire, namely a faculty of determining itself to action as an intelligence. In other words, by laws of reason independently on natural instincts, now were determined according to the laws of nature, ceases. There our explanation ceases also, and nothing remains but the defense, the removal of the objections of those who pretend to have seen deeper into the nature of things, and thereupon boldly declare freedom impossible. We can only point out to them that the supposed contradiction that they have discovered in it arises only from this, that in order to be able to apply the law of nature to human actions, they must necessarily consider the man as an appearance. Then when he demanded of them that they should also think of him, quo, intelligence as thing itself, they still persist in considering him in the respect also as an appearance. In this view, it would no doubt be a contradiction to suppose the causality of the same subject, that is his will, to be withdrawn from all the natural laws of sensible world. But this contradiction disappears. If they would only bethink themselves and admit, as is reasonable, that behind the appearances there must also lie at their root, although hidden, the things in themselves, and that we cannot expect the laws of these things to be the same as those that govern their appearances. The subjective impossibility of explaining the freedom of the will is as identical with the impossibility of discovering and explaining an interest which man can take in the moral law. Nevertheless, he does actually take an interest in it, the basis of which in us we call the moral feeling, which some have falsely assigned as the standard of our moral judgment, whereas it must be viewed as a subjective effect that the law exercises on the will, and the objective principle of which is furnished by reason alone. In order indeed that a rational being who is affected through the senses should will what reason alone directs such beings that they ought to will, it is no doubt requisite that reason should have power to infuse a feeling of pleasure, or satisfaction in the fulfillment of duty. That is to say, that it should have a causality by which it determines the sensibility according to its own principles. But it is quite impossible to discern, to make it intangible a priori, how a mere thought, which itself contains nothing sensible, can itself produce a sensation of pleasure or pain. For this is a particular kind of causality, of which, as of every other causality, we can determine nothing but whatever a priori we must only consult experience about it. But as this cannot supply us with any relation of cause and effect except between two objects of experience, whereas in this case, although indeed the effect produced lies within the experience, yet the cause is supposed to be pure reason acting through mere idea, which offers no object to experience, it follows that for us men it is quite impossible to explain how and why the universality of the maxim as law that is morally interest. This only is certain, that it is not because its interests us that it has validity for us, for that would be hieronymy and dependence of practical reason and sensibility, namely on the feeling as its principle, in which case it could never give moral law, but that it interests us because it is valid for us men, inasmuch as it has its source in our will as intelligence. In other words, in our proper self, and what belongs to mere appearance is necessarily subordinated by reason to the nature of the thing in itself. The question then, how a categorical imperative is possible, can be answered to the extent that we can assign the only hypothesis on which it is possible, namely the idea of freedom. And we can also discern the necessity of this hypothesis and this, sorry guys, this insufficient for the practical exercise of reason, that is for the conviction of the validity of this imperative, and hence of the moral law. But how the hypothesis itself is possible can never be discerned by any human reason. On the hypothesis, however, that the will of an intelligence is free, its autonomy is essentially formal condition of its determination is a necessary consequence. Moreover, this freedom of will is not merely quite possible as a hypothesis, not involving any contradiction to the principle of physical necessity in the connection of the phenomenon of the sensible world, as speculative philosophy can show, but further, a rational being who is conscious of a causality through reason, that is to say, of a will, distinct from desires, must of necessity make it practically, that it is an idea, the condition of all his voluntary actions. But to explain how pure reason can be of itself practical without the aid of any spring of action that could be derived from any other source, how the mere principle of the universal validity of all its maxims as laws, which would certainly be the form of pure practical reason, can of itself supply a spring without any matter, object of the will in which one can incidentally take any interest, and how it can produce an interest which would be called purely moral, or in other words, how pure reason can be practical. To explain this is beyond the power of human reason, and all the labor and pains of seeking an explanation of it are lost. It is just the same as if I sought to find out how freedom itself is possible as a causality of a will. For then I quit the ground of philosophical explanation, and I have no other to go upon. I might indeed reveal to the world of intelligences, which still remains to me, but although I have an idea of it, which is well-founded, yet I have not the least knowledge of it, nor can I ever obtain to such knowledge with all the efforts of my natural faculty of reason. It signifies only something that remains over when I am eliminated everything belonging to the world of sense from the actuating principles of my will, serving merely to keep in bounds the principle of motives, taken from the field of sensibility, fixing its limits and showing that it does not contain all in all within itself, but that there is more beyond it. But this something more I know no further, a pure reason, which frames the ideal that remains after the abstraction of all matter. Knowledge of objects, nothing but the form, namely the practical law of the universality of the maxims, and in conformity with this conception of reason in reference to a pure world of understanding as a possible efficient cause, that is a cause of determining the will. There must here be a total absence of springs, unless the idea of an intelligible world is itself the spring, or that in which reason primarily takes an interest. But to make this intelligible is precisely the problem that cannot be solved. Here now is the extreme limit of all moral inquiry, and it is of great importance to determine it even on this account, in order that reason may not, on the one hand, to the prejudice of morals, seek about in the world of sense for the supreme motive, an interest comprehensible but empirical, and on the other hand, that it may not impotently flap its wings without being able to move in the for it empty space of transcendent concepts, which we call the intelligible world, and so lose itself amid chimeras. For the rest, the idea of a pure world of understanding as a system of all intelligences, and to which we ourselves as rational beings belong, although we are likewise on the other side members of the sensible world. This remains also always a useful and legitimate idea for purposes of rational belief, although all knowledge stops at its threshold, useful, namely, to produce in us a lively interest in the moral law. by means of the noble idea of a universal kingdom of ends in themselves, rational beings, to which we can belong as members, then only when we carefully conduct ourselves according to the maxims of freedom, as if they were laws of nature. A concluding remark. The speculative employment of reason with respect to nature leads to the absolute necessity of some supreme cause of the world. The practical employment of reason with a view to freedom leads also to absolute necessity, but only of the laws of the actions of a rational being as such. Now it is an essential principle of reason, however employed, to push its knowledge to a consciousness of its necessity, without which it would not be rational knowledge. It is, however, an equally essential restriction of the same reason that it can neither discern the necessity of what it is or what happens, nor of what ought to happen, unless a condition is supposed on which it is happens or ought to happen. In this way, however, by the consent inquiry for the condition, the satisfaction of reason is only further and further postponed. Hence, it is unceasingly seeks the unconditionality necessary and finds itself forced to assume it, although without any means of making it comprehensible to itself. Happy enough, it can discover a conception which agrees with the assumption. It is therefore no fault in our deduction of the supreme principle of morality, but an objection that should be made to human reason in general, that it cannot enable us to conceive the absolute necessity of an unconditional practical law, such as the conditional categorical imperative must be. It cannot be blamed for refusing to explain this necessity by a condition, that is to say, by means of some interest assumed as basis, since the law would then cease to be a moral law, a supreme law of freedom, and thus, while we do not comprehend the practical unconditional necessity of the moral imperative, we yet comprehend its incomprehensibility. And this is all that can be fairly demanded of philosophy, which strives to carry its principles up to the very limit of human reason. The end. I hope you enjoyed Immanuel Kant, Fundamental Principles of Metaphysics of Morals. As we have tried to manifest this new world, as we try to bring in a new paradigm, a new way of thinking, sometimes you have to go back to the past, and even though you might not agree with his philosophy, it's something to look at because other people have studied Kant in depth. And like other philosophers, it brings something to the table when it comes to how are we going to move forward with our laws, with nature, with ourselves, and how do we conduct ourselves, and how do we morally judge others? We're going through this big paradigm shift. If you're not watching the news or getting involved with it, that's even better right now, because it's all people think they're morally justified by trying to wake others up and trying to wake people up. And when people say that they're in control, we won this already. This is just a movie. Well, then you're scaring the living daylights out of people in the wrong way. And those of you who know who I am addressing right now know who I'm addressing, and it's no one probably that you think. I'm a blue state indwelling moral person who followed my own instincts, my own constitution of morality. And the people and the algorithms and the AI and all this stuff that people keep depending upon instead of going within. And I'm not saying all of them do, because a lot of them are very high vibe and frequency lovies that are doing amazing things right now. I'm only deducing this to a few. The operations that are being carried out right now, why are you still carrying on a certain narrative? You already approved, shown, and will be showing even worse scenarios to come. And adding more to this, we don't need anymore. Because the other people that are sleeping, they don't get it. They don't quite grasp the world, because it's a perpetual cycle of shit being flung out into the ether that's being created by a benevolent side to wake them up. And it's not waking them up because you're doing it in the wrong sense. So go back upstairs and talk to your 8th density, 9th density councils and say, well, yeah, I get it. It's a polarity and it's a negative and a positive. But morally, what are you doing to the children who, I'm not talking about the ones that signed up for those roles. I'm talking about the normal everyday child that has to go and view all of this. And then their parents are freaking out. Reason why I read this. We need to learn and take in all perspectives and perceptions. And we need a better world. We need a better humanity. And we can't get there if everybody keeps knocking each other down instead of listening. Not all philosophy is perfect, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but they were on to stuff. Their lives were way different than ours. They had a lot more time to sit and ponder and think. Everything now is go, 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 go. You don't have time to sit and think because you need to make money, because that's our world we live in. Everything is commodity, everything is greed, everything is material. Back then, no one was judging a person for wearing a suit for a week, or that they couldn't change their shoes for 3 years. They didn't care. No one cared. No one commented. Who gave a shit? They didn't live above their means, but they didn't have to, because the world wasn't designed like that for them. So how can we bring this concept of freedom? What is being free? None of us are. It's an illusion. A big illusion. But we certainly can be sovereign. And we could take what is left of our freedom back and improve upon it and make it better. So let's get on it, guys. Sending each and every one of you love and light. I hope you all have a great night, day, evening, afternoon, brunch, lunch, dinner, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're having an amazing day. The weekend is upon us. Please be safe, be seen. Stay in a higher vibration. Laugh, giggle, look at cute baby pictures of sloths and baby raccoons and kitty cats and puppy dogs. Don't steer away into the fear. Get out of the fear complex. Stop feeding the loosh to these animals. Stop. And even if it's not the, you know, the things that we think are inhabiting human vessels, doesn't matter. Stop feeding the negative wolf. Change your mindset. And again, like in the World of Warcraft series I'm producing and putting out there, we are all different. We all have different abilities. We all are versed and learned in way too many different topics. But the beautiful thing is, like in the game of World of Warcraft, when you are needing a piece of gear and you can go into a raid group, it's a large group of people and you don't know who they are, but you know what your character is able to do. And you know the role that you need to play in order to take down that big boss. You all cohesively, as strangers, work together to do the same goal, is to take that dude down, or chick, or whatever have you, okay? So collectively, we all need to come together and use what we are good at, we are knowledgeable on. Again, I am not so well read into Kant. I'm more read into Arthur Schopenhauer. It doesn't matter. The point of the being is, this has some juicy information in there that we can use. And again, you don't have to agree with his version of what morals are. It's the idea, it's getting it out into the ether. It's asking you to think, how can we make this world better? And just like a group of strangers taking down the big boss, how are we going to come together and do that? Because everybody else is so busy running around doing their lives. No one's really sitting down and plotting how to freaking move into the next plane of existence, because everybody's worried about all this shit going on now. We have to go back to the past to find out where the fuck it went wrong. And a lot of people are on that task right now. But some of us really have to start moving forward and looking towards the future, looking back at the past and going, okay, we could take that concept, we could take this, we could take that, put it all together on a cake, and present it. So just think about that. I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Until the next time. Bye, guys. See you on the next one.